Francisco Bello, welcome to Prime Latino Media Salon. It's early in the day. Otherwise, we both would have glasses and we would be clinking because we drink. Oh, very good. Nah, but I'm talking about we drink something a little heavier. You don't want to see this on coffee, but it's always nice on wine and to share a glass of wine with you. Francisco Bello, I know you for at least 15 years. Do we go back 20?
No,
Yeah. Oh,
I think it might. I think we might, and that's kind of amazing.
right.
No, not 20, but close.
Right.
Close.
But I know you for at least 15 years. I
Yeah.
mean, I know you when you were working with Hugo Perez on the documentary that he did on the Polish poet who
Hungarian poet MIklós
I'm sorry,
Radnóti. Yeah.
right, the Hungarian poet who perished in the Holocaust. And that, before we talk about your greater works, I mean, we're also a sum of our past. I don't think there's anything more difficult than telling a story about someone who's deceased and died in the 1940s during the Holocaust. And you were able to pull off a wonderful story that lasted over 60 minutes. And you were the main editor of that project. How it was pulling, I mean, I find that an insurmountable feat. But the end result, it's one of my favorite films. And that was one
Thanks.
of the earliest projects. I mean, how did
Yeah, you're bringing me back. I haven't thought about that project in a long time. That is around 15 years ago. I mean, Hugo Perez, the director, he did a lot of incredible research, found scholars. Who knew MIklós Radnóti's work. He was published in a collection, I believe it was edited by Carolyn Forche. It was called Poetry of Witness, something like that, which is a collection of poets who had a kind of observational documentary component to their poetry, that they were living through some kind of atrocity and documenting it, but in a literary poetic form. And Radnóti was one of the centerpiece poets featured in that. I think that's how he found them. And then also Hugo made a coup of finding his wife, who's still alive at the time. She's passed away since. And basically, like, I think through scholars, through the poetry, I think is key, reconstructed his last days, where he was literally writing until his last moment, and his final poems, his sort of great testament, was found in the pocket of his corpse, I hate to say it, buried in a mass grave, and he was writing up until the last moment. And it's a real document, a poetic document, but a document. And so it was about, he shot some beautiful Super 8 footage that was sort of evocative and poetic in its own way. And we sort of filled it up with archival footage, all the tricks and smoke and mirrors of documentary making. But the core is this incredible story, right?
It was a beautiful story. And then it also coincided with the 100th anniversary of his birth. There's a school named in Hungary after him. There was a celebration.
I forgot about all that stuff, yeah.
But also what's interesting about you here, I'm wearing the Guayabera today because we're part of the Cuban mafia, you and I. We will always be connected to that. But that it's interesting that we also don't operate in a ghetto. Here you are, a Cuban-American, did a film on a Jewish Holocaust person who perished. And then you've been drawn to other international works. You focused on a poet and artist from China, and that was a remarkable piece. That also went to the TíoLouie Film Festival, did it not?
Yeah, so I made a film I made this film called Dreaming Against the World with good friend and another regular filmmaking partner, Tim Sternberg. We had previously made a short doc called Salim Baba that did really well. It was like a 15-minute piece about a projectionist, a guy who in India, in Kolkata, who goes around the streets with like a mobile theater, late 1800 Lumiere hand-cranked projector, and shows movies to kids. It got nominated for an Oscar and some Emmys, and so this was a follow-up film.
I was going to say, it was not only a remarkable short film, it got nominated for an Academy Award.
And it was amazing.
My
it was
mother,
amazing for us to
my,
see it
my
happen.
mother, who never met you and is one of your biggest fans, says no matter what happens to Francisco in life, in his obit, it will
In
always
my orbit, yeah.
open up, will be the Academy Award nominated filmmaker, Francisco Bello. And that the beauty again is, as a Cuban American, you focused on a story in India. You've done a story on an artist and painter who was imprisoned. Uh, was it during the Mao Revolution and so on?
So
Uh,
yeah, so the follow-up film to Salim Baba was Dreaming Against the World that Tim and I co-directed, and that was about this incredible Chinese writer and painter Mushin, who like a lot of intellectuals in China during the Cultural Revolution, was on the wrong side of the popular, I don't want to say uprising because it was very orchestrated, but he was just on the wrong side of it and just persecuted in various ways. And our story largely focuses on the work that he created in secret, really risking his life to write dialogues with Dostoevsky and Shakespeare, and these little placid landscape paintings, which if you see them in isolation, you're like, wow, that's really genteel and sort of romantic. But when you put them in the context of the time they were created, they were radical, except he defies that. And that's the tension in the film where, our question is, how can a landscape painting be politically radical? It's when you look at it through the lens of history, but Mushin would say like, no, because that limits me and my work is bigger than that. And I would say he's right as well, So it's kind of a multifaceted way to look at this guy's body of work, who has since gotten from being sort of, if in a metaphorical, if not literal blacklist, to being, celebrated and currently like in canon, and having a brick and mortar museum dedicated to his work in mainland China. I mean, it's a crazy transformation that is emblematic of how China has revised its own history too.
and then you go on and you do a film again. How I celebrate you and think you're so wonderful. You then go do a film, a highly acclaimed film, War Don Don, about an African who is tried for war crimes in Den Haag in the Netherlands, in the International Criminal Tribunal. And again, you hopscotch from one part of the world to the other. How did you get that project, and what did that project mean to you?
So that piece was actually, it didn't take place in Hagen. I can understand that, because it was an international criminal court, but it was an ad hoc one. It was a hybrid one, and it was held in the country of the conflict, where the trial was focused, in Sierra Leone in West Africa. That project originated with a very good friend of mine, also a recurring collaborator. We're about to start working on something next week, actually. Rebecca Richmond Cohen, who had access to working herself before she was even making a film at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. We were both assistant editors on Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, so we kind of came up in the trenches together. And she wanted to make this film. I kind of signed on. The other person on the team was Nadia Hallgren, who has since emerged as a director, filmmaker in her own right. Just directed the film about Michelle Obama. I think it's called Becoming. So it was just kind of like, we were like babies in our early 20s at the time, but living for months in Sierra Leone on a number of rounds of shoots, covering this trial that I sort of saw as like a Rashomon, because Rebecca's angle, which was a thoughtful one, and for me presented storytelling opportunities, is that his guilt, the accused, Issa Cisse, was a foregone conclusion. We're talking about crimes against humanity. It's some of the worst imaginable stuff. But he also
he was convicted. By the end of the film, is he convicted?
He was going to, like, we opened the film with his conviction. It begins with the conviction, but then we sort of kind of work our way through the story. Our cliffhanger is sentencing, because how do you consider a guy who did all this terrible stuff, but also could be responsible for bringing the peace, but also was manipulated into bringing the peace, having been told that he would get some kind of immunity that was yanked out from under him. So it's a story of sort of geopolitics. It's a story of like international war crimes tribunals. It's a story about a guy who is just a kid who's conscripted into the war, but rises through the ranks, becomes an unexpected leader of a rebel group that's associated with some of the most infamous war crimes imaginable. And yet it's a more complicated picture. That's what was always attractive to me. It was just a situation that defies expectations. You think it's going to be, you get the top line like, oh, it's going to be a war crimes film. Like, no, it's actually this whole other thing, you know.
And not only are you an Academy Award nominated filmmaker, but that, you know, you just finished premiering a documentary in the Tribeca Film Festival for its 20th anniversary on the South Bronx. Again, you're not from the South Bronx. And that's the beauty. You're not Indian, and that's the project you were nominated for an Academy Award. You did a film on a Chinese poet, artist. You're not Chinese, and you're not African. And this was a film centered, the war done in Europe, because that's where the International Tribunal Court system. And then you can easily segue into the South Bronx, into a story about Takeover, set in 1970, and the takeover of Lincoln Hospital by the Puerto Rican group, the Young Lords. How, you know, tell me about that film project for you.
Yeah, so I on that again, you know, but a lot of these projects were like, some of them I'm a producer and a director on, and Takeover editing, so limited to that. Writer and editor, co-sharing a credit with Emma Francis Snyder, the director. In a way, I sort of feel like, of the projects we're talking about, I felt closest to Takeover. A, it's a New York story. B, I'm from Queens. Queens is just a bridge ride across the Triborough. I still call it the Triborough, to the Bronx. And Puerto Ricans and Cubans were neighbors. You know, we share a lot of culture.
As we
food.
say, we're the same bird but different wings.
Yeah, no, exactly. You know, and I grew up, you know, and in New York, I grew up around more Puerto Ricans than Cubans. You know,
We're
so,
honorary Puerto Ricans in New York.
Yeah, our flags are kind of, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, Emma had been working on this film for a long time. You know, she came at it from her own background and as an activist, and came to sort of see the Young Lords as a very effective organization and visionary in their focus on healthcare. I mean, really visionary when you sort of see where we're at right now, and landed in things they've been asking for and fighting for decades. And the film, I was attracted to it also because of its approach. It had this kind of Battle of Algiers style approach to reenacting this takeover of this public hospital in the South Bronx, with testimony of the real people involved and mixing archival footage. It sort of had this sort of the stew of ingredients creatively that attracted me.
And what I found fascinating about it was it also included reenactments.
Well, that's what I mean. Like the Battle of Algiers style stuff, like recreated this takeover itself, beat by beat, which was covered on the outside by the news media, but the recrees were taking you inside. Right. to dramatize the words, the descriptions, blow by blow, of the interviewees. But the style is of the Battle of Algiers. I'll keep saying that, and it's a flattering but I think appropriate compliment to Emma and her DPs, that they created this handheld guerrilla style Super 8 aesthetic, because that was the look of the time, and it creates this intensity that turns it into what she wanted, which is another part of attracted me, which is to make a film that has an activist angle, has a historical angle, but it's a heist film. I mean, it's really like it's called Takeover, and that's what you watch for a lot of it. And it braids the history of the Young Lords with this blow by blow, minute by minute forensic dissection of this takeover that was very consequential.
Not only are you an acclaimed filmmaker who has been featured in, festivals around the world, but you've also been screened on television nationally, on CNN with your documentary on Nixon, which can blow anybody's mind away. And Nixon was before your time, but you're now going to be premiering on television shortly with a documentary set about the Pandemia, The Next Wave, which I was privy to see a rough cut, a final cut of it, and I thought it was brilliant. You forewarned me. I cried for 90 minutes, which means you did a wonderful job. And so tell me about that experience that is still so fresh for us in a city where over 31,000 people have died, and and we're barely coming out of a post-pandemia. How was it for you working on that cultural exploration?
Yeah, so it hasn't been released yet. There's a teaser of his film online. It's called The First Wave. It's co-produced by NatGeo, participant, and Neon. So keep your eyes open if you're interested in this film. I think it's a historically important and intense film, directed by Matt Heineman. I was one of the editors alongside. I'm humbled by this crew to be a part of them: David Zeef and Gabe Rhodes. And incredible producers like Leslie Norville, and Jenna Millman and Joe Don Okun. Just a real all-star cast. I mean, and the shooters. They were basically, this is the first 4 months of the pandemic in New York City, focused particularly on one New York hospital. And you're like inside the wards. It is death, it is panic, it is trauma, but also hope as time passes, clarity as doctors in the beginning and healthcare providers and nurses in particular, the frontline people, are scrambling to figure out how do you treat this? How do you manage the influx of patients, the volume of bodies? How do you navigate families that can't visit their loved ones? But then over time, as one doctor puts it, understanding the pattern, understanding the illness, and gradually getting to better outcomes. But you really witness that from the inside of the hospital walls, that unless you're a healthcare worker or a patient, you may not have experienced, because it really hasn't been covered in the United States the way this film does. And it's a tough, I think it's ultimately rewarding. I wish, personally speaking, it could be seen sooner, because it's a real, call to people to be like, this is not make-believe. If you're not sort of immunocompromised or have other issues, get vaccinated, because you don't want this. And even if it's not about you, it's about the health workers and all the other peoples that could contract it from you. And it shows you the worst of it, and it's in its worst moment from the inside. So I'm desperate for this film to come out. What it was like working on it, this is the room where I did the editing, and it was being done concurrent, more or less in real time, to the events. And I'll be frank, I think the other crew members would be the same. It was emotionally and physically exhausting, even for those of us that were not on set, but were living with this material for months, crafting it. Like it was, at its apex, I was crying every day.
Plus, the beauty of the film and why I loved it with a ribbon around it was, you cannot talk about the first 4 months of this pandemia without talking about the social revolution that ensued. And that was covered beautifully and uniquely. And it really, I can't encourage people to see this when it comes out. Before I let you go, hearing your journey, are you a closeted cultural anthropologist? As all this universe that you navigate so well and that you like to peer, are you a cultural anthropologist by curiosity, by design, by accident?
I don't know if I'm an anthropologist, because I think there needs to be like a scientific or methodical rigor to it. I'm just interested in stories and people, and if it ends up being, as it frequently seems to, I don't think about it that way. In terms of a design of a career, like an arc of a career, that those stories hop around from culture to culture. I sort of am looking at it like, okay, how do I, contribute to the story, and put the specifics of the culture and history of the place front and center to the best of my ability, working with people of that place to sort of, help, shed light on blind spots, etc., but then eventually tear away that stuff so that when you sort of peer through the specifics, you start to see the universal, the sort of human stuff. And I know it's very kumbaya and lofty sounding, but when a film works about a culture distinct of your own, that's usually what's been achieved. And that's at least what you're striving for, you know?
So now, as a feminist, I'm going to ask a question that is normally asked of women, but we rarely ask of men, which is, hearing this great volume of high caliber work that you've done on an international scale, how do you juggle a family? Which means, and you have a young family, you have an 8-year-old daughter, a 5-year-old daughter, your wife, and you have an aging mother as an only child who's slightly infirmed. How do you juggle all of that and successfully accomplish and develop projects?
A lot of not too much sleep. I'm trying to exercise more. Yeah, it's constant. Any working, you know, parent or caretaker, you know, of any sort, who works in a demanding field has the same struggle in their own way. So I don't know, it's day to day.
So
I lost a lot of hair.
So I always like to ask my independent artists who I admire that someone like you is worth more than 2 cents. What is your 10 cents worth of advice for developing a project?
You know, it's interesting.
And I know you've talked about being an editor, but I know you also as a brilliant director and producer. So what's your advice for developing a project strategically so that it actually gets picked up?
Well, it's tough because I'll be honest. So I mean, right now I'm aggressively developing 3 projects. You know, one is a scripted interactive drama, another is a docuseries, and a third is a documentary feature that has majority animation. My background actually before I became a filmmaker was I intended to be a cartoonist. I studied art, etc. So this is my opportunity to, you know, get back into that. I can't say more about them for now, but to me, it's a game of probability. And like, unfortunately, because of at least my level of resources, which I assume is going to be similar, if not slightly more privileged than some of the people in your audience, it's just a ton of sweat equity, a ton of self-investment. So it becomes time management. For me, I tend to pick projects that are a little bit more evergreen because of my family situation. I don't have the ability or energy to follow as a documentarian a cinema verite story that's unfolding. I just can't drop everything to go shoot something as it's happening. There are filmmakers that have built their lives in a way that can do that. I'm not one of them. But I would say for the projects that I've made, I have twice as many that I have tried to make and didn't get made. And so my analogy, and it's not super original, is that you throw a bunch of balls up in the air, but you paint those balls and you make them beautiful and attractive. And the one that defies gravity and doesn't fall to the ground, that's the film that the project that gets made. But you have to be okay with the ones that drop. And I've also sort of come to accept, it's taken me time to realize this, it's okay to mourn the projects that don't get made, but don't get stuck on them. And because I've gotten stuck and it's sort of, I've lost time, and time is our greatest commodity, especially when you're dealing with life in addition to work, you know.
And I just have to cite that you are also the recipient of the National Association of Latino Independent Producers Estela Award, named after my mother. So
it's back there.
Right. That's another reason my mother loved you. We were in LA when you got the award. My mother was in Florida, right, 3 hours behind, and it was nighttime. And I had my mother on the phone, and she could not have been prouder.
Oh, that's cute.
And so we're proud of you. We love the work you do. We have so much more to see from you. And last thing is, as a proud Latino, do you ever see producing or being involved in a Spanish language project?
it's to me, the language it's the story. Like, yes, of course, if it's got a story that I'll find interesting and I can bring value to, of course. I never set out to say I'm only going to make films in Africa, Asia, and about American presidents. There's no plan here. To me, it's like, what's available at the time, what's on and what can I get most excited about, based on what's in front of me,
So great. So you owe me a rain check so that we can clink glasses together.
That's virtual clink right here.
Virtual clink, and let's celebrate soon before the end of the year of something fabulous that's happening for you. So un abrazo. Thanks for being here with Prime Latino Media. I'm TíoLouie, Francisco Bello.
Thank you for having me.
Many more projects. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Louis.